Summer 1943. A German soldier, fresh from 2 years of brutal fighting in North Africa, stood in the American POW camp in Tennessee, staring at a bottle of brown liquid that seemed to shimmer with an impossible promise. He had never seen anything like it. The label read, Coca-Cola, but the concept of such a drink was beyond his comprehension. After months of subsisting on stale biscuits and ersatz coffee, the very idea of something sweet, fizzy, and refreshing seemed like a dream. The soldier's hands shook slightly as he held the bottle, watching the carbonation bubble and fizz to the surface, a strange sensation of disbelief washing over him. Summer 1943. The heat of the season still clung to the air as the first wave of 371,683 German prisoners of war arrived in the United States, each one a soldier who had survived the brutal campaigns in North Africa. These men, once part of the German war machine, were now on the other side, caught in a conflict they had never imagined: the psychological war that would unfold in the American POW camps. They had been prepared for harsh treatment, told that the Americans would be brutal, their prisons filled with starvation and cruelty. It was the image they had been fed throughout their training, through the insidious propaganda of the Third Reich. But nothing could have prepared them for what awaited them. As the prisoners were herded into the camps, the first stark contrast between their expectations and reality hit them hard. The Americans, whom they had been conditioned to view as weak and disorganized, turned out to be well-organized and extraordinarily generous with their resources. The men who had once feared their American captors now stood bewildered as they were given food in portions they had not seen in years, and comfort that they could not have imagined in the harsh deserts of North Africa. What they encountered was a civilization built not on scarcity, but on abundance, and that abundance extended even to their enemies. The first time a German soldier walked into a camp supply room, he was struck by what he saw. There were boxes of food everywhere, stacked high, and they contained more than just the rations they had expected. There were chocolates, candies, and drinks, items so unfamiliar to them in a wartime environment that they couldn't grasp what was happening. The soldier looked in disbelief at the piles of food, staring at the treats that seemed like relics from a different world. He had been raised to believe that such luxuries were reserved for the privileged few, if they existed at all. But here, in the American prison camp, they were casually available to everyone, even to prisoners of war. He could hardly believe his eyes. The food, real, fresh food, was so plentiful that it seemed unreal. For a soldier who had spent the last 2 years in the harsh conditions of North Africa, where meals consisted of hard biscuits and watered-down coffee, this was an impossible sight. The food was not just basic sustenance. It was varied and rich, things they had longed for in the desert but never dared to hope for. Fresh eggs, pancakes with syrup, fruits, even the rare pleasure of sweet, comforting chocolate. These things had been unknown to them for so long that it felt like they had stepped into a dream. What struck them even more was the casualness of it all. In their own military service, food had been scarce, and when it was available, it was rationed with careful precision. The German soldiers had been used to the idea of scarcity and deprivation as a normal part of life. But in America, it seemed as though food flowed effortlessly, from the canteens to the mess halls, from the supply rooms to the hands of every man. There was no apparent shortage, no rationing, no deprivation. The soldiers had to question everything they thought they knew about the world. What is this? One of them might have wondered, overwhelmed by the simplicity of the abundance before him. Why are they giving us this? What have we done to deserve it? It wasn't just the food that stunned them. It was the very concept of such abundance. The very notion that food could be so plentiful, so easily accessible, was something that conflicted deeply with the values they had been taught in Germany. For years, they had been told that America was a land of disorder, weak and fragmented, a country that would never be able to stand up to the power of the Third Reich. They had been taught that the American people were soft, their society degenerate and feeble. But here, in this prison camp, they saw not a weak nation, but one that could provide for itself and even for its enemies in a way that they had never imagined possible. What they could not have known, as they sat down to their first full meal in what seemed like forever, was that this experience would become a turning point in their understanding of the world. For many of them, it would mark the beginning of a profound psychological shift. They had entered these camps expecting to be treated with cruelty, but instead, they were receiving kindness and generosity from a nation they had been told to despise. For these soldiers, the impact was more than just physical. It was deeply emotional. They had expected punishment, hardship, and suffering. Instead, they were met with comfort, food, and care. With every meal, with every snack, and with every drink of cold Coca-Cola, their sense of reality began to fracture. It became clear that everything they had believed about the world, their propaganda, their ideology, was crumbling. Their understanding of America, once based on the caricature of a weak and decadent nation, was quickly replaced by something far more complex and bewildering. The simple act of providing prisoners with food, luxurious food by their standards, had already begun to undermine the very core of their belief system. How could a nation that had been painted as weak and divided be capable of such extraordinary abundance? How could it offer such comfort to its enemies without hesitation? For these German soldiers, each bite of food, each taste of American kindness, was a blow to their worldview. Their idea of the war, their place in it, and their very understanding of the world were being shattered by a reality they could not have imagined. What had seemed like an easy war to win was beginning to look increasingly uncertain. How could they win when the Americans were not only better equipped, but also better fed, more organized, and capable of treating their enemies with more dignity than they had ever been shown themselves? He had come to this place expecting the worst. Nazi propaganda had led him to believe that he would be starved, beaten, and brutalized by the Americans. Instead, the very first taste of Coca-Cola shattered everything he had been told. It was not just a drink. It was a symbol of everything that had been hidden from him about America. He had been taught to view the Americans as weak, decadent, and divided. But the reality before him could not have been more different. The Americans, who had once been portrayed as the enemy, were offering him something he had never dreamed of: a drink that was not only available in abundance but was treated like a common, everyday product. The realization came slowly at first, but it soon became undeniable. Their enemy was not the weak, fragmented nation they had been led to believe. America was stronger than they had ever imagined, and this strength was not only military, but rooted in the abundance that surrounded them. The experience was profound, shaking the prisoners to their core, leading them to question everything they had known about their country, their war, and their role in it. For the Germans, what had started as a simple act of receiving food turned into an ideological revolution. They had entered the camps expecting to be starved and humiliated, but they left with a far deeper realization. The war was not just a battle for territory. It was a battle of ideologies, of cultures, and of systems. And the system they had been fighting for was beginning to crumble, piece by piece, with every meal served in these American prison camps. As the days passed in the American POW camps, the German prisoners began to come to a slow, dawning realization. They had not simply found themselves in a country with an abundance of food. They had stumbled into a land that operated with an efficiency and scale that was almost incomprehensible. America was not just a country that could produce goods in large quantities. It was a country that could distribute them with remarkable speed and precision. This was not a random act of generosity or a sporadic outpouring of resources. What the prisoners were witnessing was part of a much larger system, a system of mass production, logistical coordination, and meticulous planning that had been built into the very fabric of American society. Everything they saw in the camps, the abundant meals, the large quantities of food, the regular deliveries of goods, was not accidental. It was the result of decades of industrial development, a carefully organized network of manufacturing, transportation, and distribution that worked seamlessly to ensure that supplies were available at all times. Each new shipment of food, each new crate of goods that arrived, reinforced the prisoners' growing sense of awe and disbelief. These resources never seemed to run out, never seemed to be delayed. Every meal was fresh and plentiful. Every can of fruit, every bottle of soft drink, was part of an endless flow of supplies that seemed to defy the logic of scarcity. This constant availability of goods was something entirely new to the prisoners. In the chaos of the war, where rations were sparse and unpredictable, they had grown used to the constant threat of hunger and deprivation. The meals in the German army, when they came, were often basic, often stale, and often insufficient. The supplies the prisoners had received in North Africa, and later in their captivity, had been paltry compared to what was on offer in the American camps. It wasn't just that the Americans were feeding them more, it was the sheer regularity of it. Every day brought more, and they never seemed to be running out. They had grown accustomed to the grim reality of wartime shortages. But here in America, they were witnessing a logistical miracle. The prisoners began to notice the meticulous nature of the system that sustained them. There was no haphazard, disorganized distribution of food or supplies. Everything was standardized. Meals were served on time, every day without fail. The foods were varied, carefully packaged, and always of high quality. The kitchens in the camps worked with a kind of precision that the German soldiers could only admire. There was no wastage, no delays, no waiting for supplies to arrive. It was as if the entire system was built to deliver what was needed, when it was needed, in perfect coordination. The prisoners started to realize that what they were experiencing was not just luck or an act of mercy. It was the result of a well-oiled industrial and logistical machine that the Americans had perfected over years of planning. The more the prisoners saw, the more they began to understand that what they had been taught to believe about America was deeply flawed. The notion that the Americans were weak, disorganized, and inefficient now seemed laughable. What they were experiencing was the complete opposite. The country they had been taught to hate, to mock, was operating with a level of efficiency that dwarfed anything they had experienced in Germany. They were witnessing a society where the means of production, factories, farms, transportation networks, worked not just for the benefit of its citizens, but for everyone within its reach, even for its enemies. This realization was as disorienting as it was eye-opening. The prisoners had expected to be starved and mistreated, but instead, they were being fed better than they had ever been in the war. The system that had allowed for such a high standard of living, even in the midst of a global conflict, seemed almost impossible to comprehend. For the first time, many of the prisoners began to see America not as the nation they had been taught to despise, but as a society of extraordinary strength and organization. They began to understand that the American industrial system was not just producing things, it was producing abundance. The mass production of food, clothing, and even luxuries like chocolates and soft drinks was not a rare occurrence but a daily part of life in the United States. They saw how the Americans could produce goods in unimaginable quantities, ensuring that no one went without, even in the most difficult of times. They had seen how their own country had been rationing and scraping by throughout the war. But America seemed to have an endless supply of resources, a wellspring that never ran dry. Even in the midst of their captivity, the German soldiers could not help but marvel at the scale of American production. It wasn't just the food that amazed them. It was everything. The way the American military ran, the way the camps were organized, the way the transportation and supply systems worked. Every aspect of American life seemed to be built on efficiency and abundance. Even their simple, everyday experiences were punctuated by this sense of plenty. The prisoners, who had once lived with the constant fear of hunger, were now surrounded by food in quantities that seemed surreal. They began to understand that the food they were receiving was not just a luxury. It was a symbol of something much larger. It was a symbol of the American way of life, one based on mass production, industrial power, and the ability to provide for all of its citizens, even those who had once been its enemies. The more the prisoners interacted with the system, the more they realized that this was not just a temporary reprieve. It wasn't just a matter of them receiving better treatment because they were prisoners of war. This was the American way of life, a way of life that was built on industrial power, logistical precision, and a level of production that the Germans could never hope to match. The prisoners began to realize that the same system that was feeding them was also propelling the American war effort. This logistical capability, the ability to supply armies across vast distances with regularity and efficiency, was one of the reasons why the Americans were winning the war. They were not only outproducing their enemies, but they were also outsupplying them, ensuring that their forces were always well-equipped, always fed, and always ready to continue the fight. This simple, fizzy drink marked the beginning of a transformation that would ripple through the minds of German prisoners of war. The Coca-Cola was more than just a beverage. It was a revelation. Across American prison camps that summer, over 370,000 German soldiers, who had spent years fighting on the harshest fronts, were introduced to a world of abundance they had never imagined. They encountered a country where ice cream was a common treat, where candy bars were available at every corner store, and where food that was considered a luxury in Germany was part of everyday life in the United States. For the prisoners, this wasn't just a moment of indulgence. It was a moment of realization. This realization became a turning point for many of the prisoners. They had entered the camps expecting to be treated as the enemy, expecting to face a harsh and punishing regime. Instead, they were witnessing a system that was not only humane, but also impressively effective. The food they were being given, the comfort they were receiving, and the logistics behind it all began to unravel their understanding of the war. America, with all its wealth and power, was not just fighting a war for victory. It was fighting a war to preserve a system that could produce abundance for all its people, even its enemies. The German soldiers, once convinced of their superiority, now found themselves humbled by the industrial might of a country they had long underestimated. This process of realization was not immediate for all the prisoners, but it became clearer with each passing day. The more they saw of the American system, its efficiency, its abundance, its capacity for production, the more they began to understand the true scale of the challenge they were facing. The war, they realized, was not just a battle for territory or resources. It was a battle of systems, one based on scarcity and control, and the other based on abundance and freedom. The prisoners began to understand that America's true strength lay not just in its military power, but in its ability to organize, produce, and sustain its people and its war effort at a scale that Germany simply could not match. As the days passed in the American POW camps, the German soldiers began to feel a mounting sense of disillusionment. What had initially seemed like an oddity or a temporary escape from the harsh realities of war was starting to turn into a profound and unshakable realization. The discrepancy between the image they had been fed about America, a land of weakness and chaos, and the reality they were experiencing grew more apparent with each passing day. The camp, with its well-maintained facilities, abundant food, and seemingly endless supplies, was not just a small anomaly. It was an entire system functioning in a way that contradicted everything they had been taught to believe. At first, it was the food. The prisoners had expected basic rations, if not outright deprivation. Instead, they were offered a variety of foods that seemed endless. Every day, as they walked around the camp, they passed vending machines stocked with Coca-Cola, candy bars, and even ice cream. For men who had spent months surviving on meager rations in North Africa, sometimes reduced to subsisting on hard biscuits and water, this was a sight they could barely comprehend. It was as if they had stumbled into a different world, one where food was abundant and readily available to all, including those considered the enemy. The candy, the drinks, the treats that they had long ago thought were reserved for the privileged few in Germany were suddenly part of their everyday experience. They had been told that Americans were weak and decadent, but everything they saw contradicted that narrative. At first, it was a sense of amazement that the prisoners felt. The sheer volume of supplies, the regularity with which they were delivered, and the ease with which they could access things they had not seen in years were all overwhelming. But as the days turned into weeks, that amazement began to fade, and a deeper, more unsettling realization began to take root. This wasn't just a case of good fortune, nor was it some kind of temporary indulgence granted by their captors. What they were witnessing was the result of something far more significant: an entire system built on mass production, organization, and abundance. It wasn't just the food. It was the entire infrastructure of American society that seemed so completely different from what they had been taught to believe. The prisoners, who had been fed a steady diet of Nazi ideology, which painted America as a country on the brink of collapse, began to see that their beliefs were fundamentally flawed. The very idea that America could be weak was slowly disintegrating in front of their eyes. They had been taught that Americans were disorganized, that their society was fragile, and that they were incapable of producing enough to even sustain their own people. What they were witnessing in the American camps, however, was an industrial machine in full swing. The American factories, bustling with activity, produced more than anyone had told them possible. The supply lines that fed the prisoners were just one example of the vast industrial capacity that had been built in the United States, capacity that they could never have imagined. The factories were not just producing enough to feed their own population. They were producing at a scale that was far beyond anything they had seen in Germany. The most disturbing realization came not from the food itself, but from the understanding of the system that made it all possible. Every candy bar, every bottle of Coca-Cola, and every can of fruit that arrived in the camp was the result of an industrial process that was so efficient it seemed almost beyond belief. The prisoners had been living with a wartime economy that was built on scarcity and deprivation, where rationing was a daily reality. The idea that a country could produce at such a scale, with such ease, shattered their understanding of what was possible. The American way of life, built on mass production, mass consumption, and mass distribution, was a concept that was alien to them. What was even more confusing was how America had managed to maintain this abundance despite being embroiled in a global war. The contrast with their own war economy, one that was strained and stretched to the limit, could not have been starker. As they continued to experience this abundance, the prisoners began to grapple with the implications of what they were seeing. Their belief in the superiority of their own system began to falter. They had entered the camps expecting to be treated with cruelty and deprivation, but instead, they were experiencing a level of comfort that was unimaginable in their own country. This comfort, however, was not just a physical one. It was also psychological. They had been taught that the enemy was weak, divided, and incapable of sustaining itself. But the reality was that America had built a system of production, logistics, and supply that not only supported its own population, but was now able to sustain prisoners of war with an ease that the German military had never even dreamed of. With each passing day, the prisoners began to understand that they were not simply prisoners of war in a foreign land. They were witnessing the power of an industrial system that could produce more than they had ever thought possible. The realization that they were living in a system that could create abundance, not just for the Americans, but for the defeated enemies as well, was a profound blow to their understanding of the world. They had expected to be broken, starved, and humiliated, but instead, they found themselves in a system that appeared to thrive on its ability to produce, to give, and to provide for all, even for those who had once been its enemies. This realization was not immediate for all the prisoners. Some continued to resist the idea that their ideology could be wrong. But for many, the cumulative effect of the abundance they saw around them, food, shelter, and the sheer ease of daily life, began to erode their previous beliefs. The psychological shock of seeing such abundance in the face of war was impossible to ignore. They had believed that their ideology, their system, was superior, that their way of life was built on strength and sacrifice. But in America, they saw a different kind of strength, one that was built on abundance, not deprivation. This realization began to crack their worldview. breaking down the mental barriers that had been built by years of propaganda. In the camps, where many of these men had expected only deprivation, they encountered the complete opposite. They had imagined being starved, just as Nazi propaganda had taught them to believe. Instead, they found themselves feasting on meals that exceeded anything they had tasted in years. American field rations, which American soldiers often complained about, were considered gourmet by the German prisoners. Crackers, processed cheese, candy, fruit bars, and even cigarettes. Items that had long been scarce or completely unavailable in the German military were now plentiful. For men who had endured months of hunger, these small luxuries were nothing short of astonishing. As the weeks passed, the soldiers began to understand that the war was not just about defeating the enemy on the battlefield. It was about a fundamental difference in the way the two societies operated. The Germans had been fighting for survival, for a system built on scarcity and control. The Americans, by contrast, had built a system that could generate more than enough for everyone. And as the German soldiers ate their meals and drank their Coca-Cola, they began to see that they were not just prisoners in a foreign land. They were witnessing the defeat of everything they had believed in. The war was not just about military power. It was about a clash of systems, and the American system, with its abundance and its efficiency, was winning. Several weeks into their captivity, the German prisoners began to experience a deep, unsettling shift in their perceptions. It was not the string of military defeats or the losses on the battlefield that shook them the most, but rather the overwhelming realization of America's internal strength. This strength was not something they had expected to encounter. It was not built on sheer military might, but on an economic infrastructure that seemed to run like a flawless machine. The Germans, who had once believed that defeating the Americans would be a relatively straightforward task, now began to understand the sheer impossibility of overcoming a nation that could maintain such an extraordinary level of abundance, organization, and logistical capacity. The realization struck the soldiers not just in the form of more food, but in the very nature of what they were being given. In the beginning, it was the simple pleasures that caught their attention. Sweets, candies, and luxuries like ice cream, all of which had been alien to them for years. These were not just treats they had not seen since before the war. They were symbols of an entire way of life they had never encountered before. The German soldiers, who had been living in a constant state of scarcity and deprivation, were now surrounded by an abundance that seemed incomprehensible. It was not just the quantity that was astonishing, but the fact that these luxuries, chocolates, ice creams, and soft drinks, were available to everyone, regardless of their status, rank, or nationality. For prisoners of war, who had come to expect little but hardship, this was a revelation. Each time the prisoners were handed a chocolate bar or served ice cream, the shock deepened. These were not just foodstuffs. They were symbolic of an entire system that made abundance not only possible but accessible. In their minds, the idea of producing so much for so many seemed impossible, given the conditions they had endured in Germany. They had been raised with the belief that only a select few could enjoy such luxuries, while the rest of the population endured austerity. But in America, even their captors, and even they themselves, were treated to these comforts on a daily basis. The contrast was stark and deeply unsettling. The prisoners could not reconcile the two realities. On one hand, they had been raised to believe that the German system was the superior one, built on discipline, sacrifice, and efficiency. On the other hand, they were now facing the undeniable truth that the Americans, whom they had been taught to see as weak, chaotic, and decadent, had created a society that operated with an entirely different set of rules. Rules that prioritized abundance, generosity, and accessibility. The idea that a country could produce so much, not just for its citizens but for its enemies as well, was a concept that shattered their understanding of what made a nation strong. Each new experience reinforced this cognitive dissonance. The prisoners had expected to be treated as enemies, expected to starve and suffer. Yet instead, they were being cared for in a way that contradicted everything they had been taught about war and captivity. The regular arrival of new supplies, food, clothing, and even luxuries like ice cream and soda, became a constant reminder that the Americans were not just winning the war militarily. They were winning on a deeper, more profound level, economically, socially, and ideologically. The shock began to take a toll on the prisoners. As they processed the implications of their surroundings, they began to question everything. The camp, which had initially seemed like an uncomfortable but tolerable place, slowly became a symbol of the vast gulf between their own experience and the reality of American society. The luxuries they were receiving, simple things like a cup of coffee with sugar, a chocolate bar, or a scoop of ice cream, were not just acts of kindness. They were proof of a system that had the capacity to give so much to its own people and to others, even those who had once been its enemies. This experience also revealed a deep flaw in the Nazi ideology that the prisoners had been raised on. The idea that America was a decadent, weak nation crumbled with each passing day in the camp. The abundance they encountered was proof that America was anything but weak. The prisoners, who had been taught to see their own country as the epitome of efficiency and strength, now found themselves face to face with a system that outproduced and outlasted them in every respect. The German soldiers had expected to see an America in decline, a country that would eventually collapse under the weight of its own inefficiency. What they found instead was an America that was resilient, resourceful, and, above all, capable of sustaining its people and its war effort with remarkable efficiency. This realization was devastating on a personal level. For many of the prisoners, it marked the beginning of a profound psychological shift. The idea that they had been fighting for the right side, that they had been defending a system that was superior to the one they now saw in America, was beginning to feel hollow. The constant flow of goods, the quality of life they were now experiencing in the camps, and the ease with which the Americans had created a system that could sustain them, all of it pointed to the undeniable truth. The Nazis had failed, and their system was inferior. The prisoners began to understand that the war was not just about military tactics or territorial control. It was about a battle of systems, one based on scarcity and control, the other on abundance and openness. As the weeks wore on, the psychological toll of this realization began to sink in. The soldiers began to understand that they were not just losing a war, they were losing an ideological battle as well. The very system they had believed in was crumbling, and the American way of life, one based on the principles of industrial capacity, equality, and abundance, was proving to be not only superior but unstoppable. It wasn't just that the Americans had more resources or more soldiers. It was that the American system could produce more than anyone had ever thought possible, and could do so with a level of efficiency that Germany could never match. The more they ate, the more the prisoners began to realize that what they had been told about America was a lie. The harsh, impoverished image of the United States they had been fed by Nazi propaganda began to crumble. The sheer quantity and quality of food available in the American camps was staggering. The prisoners began to understand that America's power was not just in its military strength, but in its ability to provide, to offer, and to give to its people, and even to their enemies. This abundance was a symbol of something greater, something the Germans had never imagined: industrial capacity, organization, and a society that could provide for all its citizens, even in the midst of war. The abundance that the German prisoners encountered in the American camps was not just a physical luxury, it was an ideological defeat. Each chocolate bar, each scoop of ice cream, each can of fruit was a small, insidious victory in a larger ideological battle. It was as if each treat was a reminder that the system they had fought for, the system that had promised them glory and dominance, was not only wrong, but unsustainable. The more they consumed, the more they realized that America's true strength lay not in military power, but in the power to create, to sustain, and to give. The simple act of providing food and comfort to their enemies was perhaps the most powerful weapon America could wield in this war. As the war continued, the realization grew steadily within the minds of the former German prisoners of war. They began to understand that America was not only capable of defeating them on the battlefield, but that it had the power to win on an entirely different level. The American victory extended beyond military prowess. It was deeply rooted in the economic, social, and cultural structures that powered the nation. What had once been a vague notion, the idea that the United States could outlast them not only in terms of military might but in every aspect of society, was becoming a concrete truth for the prisoners. They had arrived expecting to face cruelty and deprivation, but instead, they had encountered a nation that was not only organized to fight but also organized to survive and thrive, even in the most extreme conditions. The lessons they had learned in the American prison camps about abundance, efficiency, and the power of industrialization were profound. The system they had encountered was one of unimaginable scale, from the simple acts of feeding prisoners to the creation of vast logistical networks that ensured that no one, no matter their status or nationality, was left without what they needed. It was a revelation for the prisoners who had once been taught to see their own country as the model for a superior civilization. What they saw in America, however, was a society built on principles of mass production, standardization, and availability for all. The German soldiers had been told that America was disorganized, inefficient, and unable to provide for its citizens. But what they saw and experienced in the camps was the complete opposite. The abundance was not just a matter of food, but a reflection of an entire way of life. In 1945, when these former prisoners returned to Germany, they were confronted with the harsh reality of their country's collapse. They had come from a world where food, comfort, and luxury had become available to them in abundance, only to return to a land of scarcity and deprivation. They were met with the ruins of a nation, where even basic necessities were hard to come by. The contrast between the two worlds was jarring. The prisoners had witnessed what true industrial power looked like, and now they were back in a country where basic rations were still being carefully measured out, where food was scarce, and where the remnants of a once great empire lay in ruins. The realization of what they had lost, their belief in the superiority of their own system, the strength of their nation, was overwhelming. The return to Germany, with all its desolation and scarcity, marked a moment of personal and ideological transformation for the soldiers. Many had gone to war believing that they were part of a righteous cause, one that would bring glory and power to Germany. But what they had witnessed in America, this wealth, this abundance, was something their own country could not even begin to offer. It became clear that the ideological principles they had been raised with were flawed, and the society they had fought to preserve was crumbling. The prisoners, who had been the soldiers of a totalitarian regime, now found themselves facing a new reality. A world where abundance was not just a dream, but an achievable reality. They had seen the American approach to production, to social care, to ensuring that no one was left behind, and they could not ignore what they had experienced. This experience in America became a cornerstone of their personal transformation. The sense of superiority that many of the prisoners had once held over other nations was replaced with a deep understanding of the importance of industrial capacity, organization, and the power of mass production. They had seen a nation that could produce goods at an unimaginable scale, a country that could not only feed its own people but its enemies as well. And this realization, this understanding of the value of production and logistics, stayed with them long after the war had ended. As the years passed, this new worldview began to influence post-war Germany. The lessons learned in the American camps about mass production and distribution would become fundamental to the rebuilding of Germany's economy in the 1950s. The country, devastated by the war, would begin to pick up the pieces and build itself anew, not through military conquest or ideological purity, but through the principles that the prisoners had encountered in America. The notion of mass production, of making goods available to all, became the cornerstone of Germany's economic miracle. The transformation of Germany was not just about rebuilding infrastructure. It was about rebuilding the mindset of its people. Those who had been prisoners of war became the first to witness the true power of America's system, and many of them took those lessons back home. They had seen that the key to success was not just in military victories, but in creating a society that could produce enough for everyone. The realization that abundance could be achieved through organization, planning, and industrial prowess became the foundation upon which the German economy would rise from the ashes of war. The influence of their time in America extended far beyond the immediate economic recovery. The lessons learned in those prison camps about how to organize resources, how to make production efficient, and how to ensure that goods reached the people who needed them were critical in shaping the future of West Germany. The former prisoners, who had once been soldiers of the Reich, became advocates for a new way of thinking, one that embraced the values of production, equality, and abundance rather than scarcity, control, and deprivation. In the years that followed, as Germany's economy grew and flourished, it was clear that the lessons learned from the American prison camps had played a key role in shaping the new nation. The very men who had been imprisoned in those camps now found themselves in positions of influence, using their newfound knowledge to help rebuild their country. The impact of American industrial practices, which had seemed like a distant dream when they were prisoners, had now become the driving force behind Germany's recovery. For the German prisoners, this was the first crack in the mental armor of Nazi ideology. They had expected to be treated with cruelty, but instead, they were treated with a level of care and humanity they had never experienced. It was this realization that would begin to shift their perception of America, and ultimately, the entire world order they had been fighting to preserve. The American system, which they had been taught to despise, was suddenly, in their eyes, a beacon of industrial power and prosperity. By the 1950s, the effects of this transformation were clear. The German economic miracle was underway, driven by the same principles that had been learned in American prison camps. The ability to produce in mass quantities, to make goods and services accessible to everyone, and to organize a society that could meet the needs of its people. The once dominant Nazi ideology, which had promised greatness through conquest, had been replaced by a new understanding of prosperity, one that came through production, cooperation, and the efficient use of resources. This shift in thinking, from scarcity to abundance, from control to freedom, was the legacy of the American experience for many of the former prisoners. They had seen firsthand how a society based on the principles of industry and generosity could thrive, and they had carried those lessons back to Germany. In doing so, they helped to lay the groundwork for a new kind of society, one that would embrace the values of production, prosperity, and democracy, values that had once seemed foreign to them but had now become their guiding principles. By the time Germany had fully recovered and became one of the world's leading economies, the impact of the American example could be seen in every aspect of its society. The lessons learned in those prison camps, where food and abundance had become symbols of a superior way of life, had transformed not only the men who had experienced it, but also the entire nation they rebuilt. The transformation from a country ravaged by war to one of the most prosperous nations in Europe was not just a miracle of economics, but a testament to the power of ideas and the enduring impact of what those prisoners had learned during their time in America. The story of how Coca-Cola and ice cream played their role in changing the mindset of German soldiers stands as a powerful testament to the idea that in a world where abundance becomes the symbol, the battle is not always won through military victories alone. The most crucial victory was the demonstration of the power of democracy through access to goods that were once out of reach. As the war raged on, the American prison camps became a microcosm of a different world, one that was not only defined by its capacity to produce in unimaginable quantities, but by its willingness to share that abundance. For the prisoners, these seemingly simple comforts became something more profound. The sight of ice cream being served in a prison camp, the availability of Coca-Cola in vending machines, and the constant flow of food and supplies that seemed to have no end, all became symbols of a larger, more powerful reality, one that undermined the very foundation of the ideologies they had fought for. For these soldiers, who had been taught to believe that Germany was the pinnacle of efficiency and strength, the shock of encountering such a system of abundance in their enemy's country was nothing short of transformational. The American way of life, with its emphasis on mass production, equality, and availability, was a direct contrast to the scarcity and control they had been taught to uphold. The German soldiers, who had spent years fighting for an ideal that promised greatness through sacrifice and deprivation, found themselves in the middle of a society that had embraced the opposite values: prosperity through production and generosity through abundance. The impact of this contrast went beyond mere surprise. It was an ideological awakening that gradually chipped away at the convictions of the prisoners. Every chocolate bar, every bottle of Coca-Cola, and every scoop of ice cream served in the camps not only fed their bodies, but began to erode the mental structures that had been carefully constructed through years of Nazi propaganda. They had entered the camps expecting to be humiliated, expecting to be punished for their roles in the war. But instead, they were met with a system that seemed designed to do the opposite, one that offered them comfort, care, and humanity in the form of food and simple pleasures. This generosity, which the prisoners never anticipated, became a stark reminder of the values that defined the very system they were fighting against. The real power of this experience lay not in the food itself, but in the realization that America's abundance was a direct reflection of the democratic principles that underpinned its society. The American system, which seemed to offer everyone a chance at comfort and security, stood in sharp contrast to the German system, which had focused on control, scarcity, and military conquest. As the prisoners absorbed this contrast, they began to question everything they had been taught about strength, power, and superiority. What they saw in America was not just an industrial powerhouse, but a country that had made abundance and equality part of its core identity. A system that could provide for its citizens and even its enemies with a level of generosity that Germany could never match. As the years passed, the lessons learned in those prison camps would remain with the former prisoners, shaping their views of the world and their understanding of what constituted true power. The knowledge that America's strength came not from military conquest, but from its ability to produce and share abundance, became a defining lesson for those who had once fought against it. The war was not just a military contest, it was a contest of ideologies. And in this contest, the victory of democracy over fascism was not only seen on the battlefield, but in the everyday acts of generosity and abundance that the German prisoners witnessed in the American camps. When these prisoners returned to Germany in 1945, the shock of their transformation was immediate. They came back to a nation in ruins, where scarcity had become a way of life, and the promise of the American system seemed even more striking. They had seen firsthand how a society built on democracy and industrial capacity could not only survive, but thrive, even in the face of war. This knowledge became a seed of change in post-war Germany. The lessons of abundance, production, and democracy that they had learned in the camps would shape the way they thought about their own country's future. The idea that prosperity could come not through conquest, but through production and distribution became a cornerstone of the economic miracle that unfolded in the 1950s. As the prisoners saw more of America's capacity for abundance, their worldview began to shift dramatically. The shock of seeing ice cream regularly served, the constant presence of Coca-Cola, and the simple but profound availability of foods and comforts they had never dreamed of was a psychological blow that they could not easily forget. The prisoners, who had once been soldiers of the Reich, now found themselves confronted with a reality that made their ideals seem distant and irrelevant. This ideological shift was not confined to the individual prisoners. It permeated the entire post-war generation of Germans who had been exposed to these ideas during their time in captivity. The contrast between the American way of life and the devastation they faced back home led many to reevaluate their country's path. The values of industrial production, equality, and abundance became the foundation of the economic policies that would rebuild Germany in the post-war years. The American approach to mass production, which had once seemed alien and strange, became the model for Germany's recovery. The story of the transformation of these prisoners, how a simple bottle of Coca-Cola or a scoop of ice cream could change their worldview, became a powerful symbol of the enduring power of democracy. These men, who had once believed in the superiority of their own system, returned to Germany not only with their bodies intact, but with their minds open to new possibilities. The American system of abundance had done what military defeat could not. It had undermined the very core of their beliefs. The victory of democracy was not just a matter of military might. It was a victory of ideas. A victory that was sealed in the hearts and minds of those who had once been its enemies. In the end, the story of the German prisoners and their encounter with America's abundance became a lesson in the power of soft power. It was not through force, but through the simple act of generosity, sharing food, sharing comforts, that America achieved a victory far greater than any military conquest. It was a victory of ideas, of systems, and of values that would reshape the world for generations to come. The war had been won, not just through the might of armies, but through the demonstration of a better way of life. The true strength of America, they realized, lay not in its weapons, but in its capacity to provide, to share, and to build a system that could sustain all who embraced it, even its enemies. For these men, the American way of life was not just different, it was a direct challenge to everything they had been taught to believe. The idea that a nation could provide so much for both its own people and its enemies, all while fighting a world war, shattered their understanding of power and strength. The simple act of giving, of sharing abundance with those who had been considered enemies, became a symbol of the true strength of America. And it was in this simple moment, sipping Coca-Cola, eating ice cream, and being fed meals they could never have imagined, that the prisoners began to understand the true nature of their defeat. This was not just a loss on the battlefield, it was a loss of their entire worldview, a loss that had been eroded by something as simple as a bottle of soda. The victory that the Americans had achieved was not only military, it was ideological. The abundance of food, the casual availability of luxuries, and the generosity with which prisoners were treated all spoke to a strength that was far greater than the German military had ever anticipated. This was the beginning of a psychological transformation that would turn the tide in a way that no battlefield victory could.